Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me on this evening of our 45th anniversary of the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Center in welcoming our guest, Mr. Dan Red.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for sitting through our propaganda film. We have some limited time. I have a few things I want to say to you, some of which are important to me, some others of which you will pick up, examine, and see whether they're important to you. But as we go through this, a couple of things are very important to me. Some nice things have been said from up here in the introduction, and which I appreciate greatly. But I trust all of you, particularly your students who remember your civics class, know what Abe Lincoln said about generous introductions. He said, "Never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves." And so it will be with you. I also trust, particularly with you students, that you may have noted that in this introduction, there was very little said about my university or college education. There's a reason for that. That I am a graduate of Sam Houston State Teachers College in Huntsville, Texas. I'm very proud of that, but we consider our school the Boston University of our part of the world, but we're perfectly aware a lot of people this far north never heard of the damn place. That they gave me about all the education I was capable of absorbing, but it's very important to go through tonight. I have some ground I want to cover with you, and we will take questions at the end. But there may be experts on the geopolitical shifts around the globe. There may be experts on the advance of technology and breakthroughs of science. But if so, you'd be surprised how few of those experts graduated from Sam Houston State Teachers College. So I hope you will keep that in mind as we go along tonight. I'll come back to education in a moment. But I want to start by saying that I'm here because Vita Palladino asked me to be here. That Vita is everything you would want your archivist to be, but more than that, she is a friend and a loyal friend, particularly who stands up for the going stuff. I appreciate that greatly, Vita. But also I'm here, and please note this, however this evening goes, I hope you understand that I'm here in memory of the late Howard Gotlieb, to whom I owe so much. But those of you who are students who don't know who he was, may know a little bit about him, or have no memory of him, you can learn from the following things, as I did. And these are in no particular order, and I recognize that I'm speaking in front of the president of the university and his lovely and also well-educated wife, who know a lot more about teaching than I'll ever know. But experience has taught me, and Howard Gotlieb taught me, that it's not only good, but it's an imperative that you study hard, that you make of yourself as good a scholar, a lifetime scholar, as you can possibly do. But don't forget the value of persistence. Howard Gotlieb was very well educated. He was an academician and a scholar in the best sense of both of those words. But even by journalistic standards, keep in mind that persistence is considered one of the best accolades any reporter could have said about him, that you are persistent. That Howard Gotlieb was persistent and determined. So when I think there's so many things about him that I remembered, so many things that I know that I learned from him or had reinforced from my previous experience in learning. But take it for whatever it may be worth, paste it at the top of your hat or bonnet and refer to it from time to time. And remember that I said to you because Howard Gotlieb was all about persistence. As you go through life, you're going to find plenty of times when you say to yourself, you know, all the schooling I got, all the education I got, all the talent I have, just not coming together for me. And when you find that time, you frequently find out that if you just stay with it, if you just put one foot in front of the other, you'd be surprised what happens. It's called persistence. So I'm not preaching at you. I'm doing my best to teach you. The lessons that I learned from, among others, Howard Gotlieb, don't underestimate the value of persistence, the value of just keep coming. Another of Howard's great assets was his sense of humor. He had a tremendous sense of humor. Particularly, he was good at poking fun at himself. I've never really talked to you about this, but he could poke fun at others, never in a mean way, but he was very good about poking fun at himself. Again, not in a mean way, but for whatever it may be worth, don't underestimate the value of humor, particularly about yourself. The other things I could go on, and it will relieve you to know that I am not going to go on, at least not about this. But one of the reasons that Howard Gotlieb was able to do what he did so early, keep in mind that when he began this archive at Boston University, he was, I think, only the second person in the country even trying to establish it. And he did not have the resources that a great public university, for example, a great state university might have. But he had a vision, and he kept moving toward that vision. And among the things that he would do is say to himself, okay, what do I think is the ideal for me? What do I want this to be? And grasp this if you can, because again, I learned it early in life, partly from my mother and father, but Howard Gotlieb reinforced it to me. It's always good to throw out what the sailors call, find your polar star, which is to say, have something out there as a goal. Know what that goal is, think carefully what it is, and then move toward it. And if you have the goal, you say, oh, that's my polar star, that's what I really want to do. From time to time, as seamen or airmen would do, you take a reading on your polar star. Is what I'm doing moving me toward my goal? Or is it some diversion and I've gotten somehow knocked off course? Howard was terrific about that. He envisioned, as long ago as the early 60s when I first met him, there was some dispute about, not dispute, there's some doubt in my own mind exactly when I first met him, but I think it was 1964. But I can tell you this, whatever it was, he already had a vision of what this has, with Peter's great help and the help of some others, has become. And so I recommend that to you. Again, I'm not trying to preach at you, I am trying to teach you as best I can some of the things that were taught to me by Howard Gotlieb or reinforced. Among his other great assets, and I recommend this to you, that he was loyal and trustworthy. I know you say, well, every Boy Scout and Girl Scout is supposed to be trustworthy, loyal, and kind. Well, he actually was all of those things. And particularly was he would do what he said he was going to do, and he would not do what he would tell you, promise you, he would not do. I was reminded of this the other night. This is a slight digression, but I have a movie I'm going to recommend to you, which I rarely do. Have any of you seen the new movie, Archival? I think it just came out last Friday. It's a Western. Guy from Texas, you'd expect I'd like a Western, that's true. But one of the things that comes through in the film is, and I won't take you all the way through it, I do recommend it. I'll give you a money-back guarantee. If you don't like it, write me, and I'll write you a check or whatever it's done. And by the way, I have no financial interest in this movie. But in cow country, and this movie was set in the early to mid 1800s, I think. In cow country, you'd rather have a man's word, if he was a good man, you'd rather have his word than a written contract. And even among the lowlife, the criminals and the thugs, it was well known that if you didn't keep your word, then you'd better move back east because you were never going to make it in the west. And Howard had that code. I was reminded of the film the other night. These guys, you can think what you will about them, but they kept their word. They also tipped their hat to the ladies, which I know is badly out of fashion and maybe never in fashion here. But in Texas, there was a time as a child, if I didn't tip my hat to every lady, my father's paw would come like that of a great bear. Whomp! And there we go. It's been a long time ago. But it was very important, particularly when he became interested in this and then started building, that people believed him. And it's well and good if somebody comes and says, well, listen, I want your papers. Well, to do what with? Well, I'm going to start this archive, and I'll be protective with you, and I will work with you. You always have to find out. Well, you say to yourself, that's what he says, but what is he going to do? Suffice to say that Howard kept his word. Very trustworthy, had a good sense of humor about himself, and he was persistent. And I'm very glad and proud to be here this evening to speak up for his memory. And Vito, I can't tell you how impressed I am that you, as his successor, there's never any replacement for anyone of Dr. Gotlieb's standing, but as successor, I give a tip of the Stetson to you, and I invite the audience to give her a good round of applause. Now I want to caution you. Number one, I have no idea of time here, so when I depend on, I have brought along, this may be of some, I have brought along a timekeeper, Mr. Phil Kim. Phil, would you stand, please? Phil is the timekeeper here. We want to be out at a reasonable time. We aren't going to keep you forever. I will take some questions at the end. I have a lot of ground I want to cover with you. Most of it I'm not going to be able to do, and I understand that. I do want you to know that out of respect of Howard Gotlieb's memory, and also out of respect to Vita and the great work she's done here, I prepared a speech. I'm not kidding you, this is not made up, it's not a prop, I'll give it to Vita later. You can see I've turned down the edges of the copy so I can turn it. Now, to use a Texas word, I reckon this is going to take me 45 minutes to read through this speech. You will be pleased and relieved to know that I'm not going to read a word of it. I will leave it with Vita. And if anybody wants a copy, I'm sure she can run it off her printing machine. This is not a lecture in microphone technique on my part. I intended to do this, but I recognize we have some time imperatives here. So let me come back to something I touched on earlier, which is understand what you're dealing with here with me. And this is not a case of my just sort of looking at my feet and running the hands around the brim of my hat and saying, oh, shucks. I am basically, in fact, fundamentally, a reporter who got lucky. Very, very lucky. And if you're a student and saying to yourself, you know, how the heck did this guy get there, wherever you may imagine there to be? How did he get where he is? Well, I can tell you, because I've lived it. It's primarily, yes, I worked hard, not as hard as some people I worked with in the oil fields early on, but yes, I worked hard, and yes, I had my polo star out there and all those things. But just understand that you can, particularly in journalism, I think this is true in a lot of fields, you can be doing a lot of the right things in the right way for a long time, but if you don't get a break, if God doesn't smile and the right people aren't watching at the right time, your break may be slowly coming, it may never come. So just understand what you're dealing with here. I'm not an expert on one thing. Having said to you, I don't know of any experts that graduated from Sam Houston State Teaching College when I went there. I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be. I'm a reporter who got lucky. I'm happy to talk to you about where the country is, where the election is for the moment, but just keep in mind what I said to you before. And I was going to point out to you, since I am in a citadel of scholarship, academics, and intellectualism in the best sense of the word, that Sam Houston is located in Walker County, Texas. Walker County is in East Texas. It's behind what we call the Pine Tree Curtain. They're very, very proud people in Walker County. I know them a lot. One of the things that they are proudest of is that it is not now, nor has there ever been in the entire history of Walker County, not one single intellectual. And they take tremendous pride in this. And if it's any interest to you, the definition of an intellectual in Walker County is if you can listen to the William Tell Overture and not think of the Lone Ranger, you are an intellectual. So please keep that in mind as we go along. Now, we're in the middle of what, in my opinion, and let me clearly italicize that word, my opinion, is an historic presidential election year. You can say, well, what else news, Dan? Where'd you get your first clue? Not exactly biblical material. But it's worth reminding ourselves that if for no other reason, and there are plenty of other reasons, if for no other reason, and however you feel about the candidacy one way or the other, the fact that the candidate for President of the United States from one of the two major parties is a person of color, that alone would make this a historic campaign, whether Barack Obama wins the presidency or not. It makes it a campaign that history books, for as far ahead as you can imagine, are going to at least mention this year's presidential campaign. Now, there are many other aspects of the campaign, most of which have surprised the daylights out of me. It isn't true that I've been covering politics since Sam Houston was writing, but I have been covering it a long while. And one of the reasons I love covering politics, and I confess that I have a passion for covering politics, is because what you most expect frequently does not occur. What you least expect very often occurs. And again, because of the phrase Texas language, ain't that the truth this time around? That the race, as we sit here, in my case stand here, in late September, has already gone. We're now talking about post-primary period. Has already gone through more surprises than most presidential campaigns would exhibit. Everything from the choice of vice president by the Republican candidate, a woman on the ticket, but also I can't remember a race when the naming of a vice presidential candidate has changed the dynamic. You may like it or not like it, but changed the dynamic of a campaign just by the naming of the vice presidential candidates. You certainly have to go back to 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon, and the naming of Lyndon Johnson as JFK's running mate that year. But as we go into October, I submit to you on the basis of my experience, and let me note that sometimes I'm wrong about these things, that this being a historic presidential campaign, each campaign is special to itself, each presidential campaign is unique to itself, but one we already know has a stronger, deeper historical center of gravity, if you will, than most. That I want to say to you directly that I think the race may get down, I'm often wrong about these things, may get down to, and I submit to you to keep your eye on, late deciders. That in most political races, not all political races, in most political races, a lot of people don't make up their mind until very late. Late deciders in presidential campaigns are generally defined those who make up their minds between Friday midnight and the time they go to the polls Tuesday. In every race, the politicians look at this because sometimes an underdog, a decided underdog, can come from far behind with the late deciders. At other times, a very close race. For example, in 1980, you may know this for those of you who read your history of that period, Friday night, midnight, Ronald Reagan versus incumbent President Jimmy Carter, the race by acclamation of the polls, dead even. By Sunday night, midnight, incumbent President Jimmy Carter was told, we have to start writing your concession speech. And you would expect he would say, what are you talking about? The election is not until Tuesday. Point was, the race was even, but over the weekend, the late deciders began to shift. They shifted in Governor Reagan's direction, and he became president. So, for those of you who like to follow this race, I suggest to you keep your eye on the late deciders. It's usually good advice in any election campaign, particularly in presidential election campaign, but it may be decisive this time. Decisive in, there's some options about being decisive, which is to say, it could be decisive as who actually wins, and it could be decisive whether one candidate or the other wins by a rather large margin. Keep in mind that a large margin these days would be 52 to 48. That would be considered a strong win by either candidate. So, my reason for mentioning the late deciders, particularly with you in this audience, and for those of you who aren't students, those of you who are, senior, forgive me if you must, but I want to talk directly to these students, because here's what I hear so often on college campuses. Man, I'm really involved. I'm really pumped about this election. And I also hear, young people are going to make a difference in this election, whatever it is, whether it's 1980s, 1990s, right on into this century. The book, if you will, that is to say the scouting report on young people who get excited about particularly presidential races. And people in politics know this, journalists talk about it among themselves, they may or may not share it with you. The book on you, that is you, those of you who are younger voters, maybe voting for the first time, maybe the second, in the 18 to 25, 26 category. I'll tell you what the book is. The book is, you talk, but you don't walk. You don't get there to the polls. I'm talking about you individually. You can say, oh, well, I'm going to get there. As a general rule, the so-called youth vote, this is what happens. It gets excited. Sometimes a majority of it seems to get excited for the Republican candidates, sometimes the Democratic candidates, sometimes it's hard to tell. But the scouting report is, they talk big, but they don't deliver. They do not get to the polls. Now, if you believe that this presidential election is one of our more important presidential votes because of what's happening around the world, what's happening in our own country, or perhaps some issue that you feel strongly about. If you believe that this is a particularly important presidential election, keeping in mind that every presidential election in a country such as ours, a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy, including free vote, but if you think this one is particularly important, then the question for you is, are you going to talk or are you going to walk? Are you going to be like the previous youth votes in presidential election years, that somehow, some way just doesn't show up? Gets an excuse for this or excuse for that. There's always an excuse. But let me suggest to you, as I think my friend Howard Gotlieb would if he were here, that excuse-making is not in the American character. That this is not something that we as a country, we as a people, as a society, have ever been particularly known for. And for some reason, we're free, we're independent, therefore we have a history, a culture of being self-reliant. Well, I don't want to digress, but let me come back to it. Figure a way to get to the polls. I do not care what party you favor. I do not care what candidate that you favor. But I do care that you care enough not to fall into that category which has become the book on the youth vote, that you talk but you don't walk. Now I'm going to take a risk here because it's been my experience that sometimes people misunderstand this. But I want to put it in as strong a terms as I possibly can to you. That however you feel about the war, whether you think it's the wrong war at the wrong time in the wrong place or the right thing to do, that you students, a lot of people roughly your age. Now, these people are in danger, in peril. Some of them face it hour after hour, day after day, week after week. They are sleeping in the rain or in the dust. Here's the point. They're doing it because they love their country. That's overwhelmingly why they're doing it. Now, if they love their country enough to go through this danger, these real perils, these kind of hardships of what the reality of service, military, diplomatic, or humanitarian in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan is, let me ask you in the gentlest terms, if they love their country enough to do that, don't you love it enough to get yourself to the polls or vote in some other way where it can count? I want to tell you a story about, this was long ago and far away, when President Johnson came to the presidency through the assassination of President John Kennedy. The presidential election of 1964 was, by and large, when I say a foregone conclusion, that President Johnson was heavily favored because the country had gone through the trauma of the Kennedy assassination in 1963, and it was widely assumed that President Johnson would win. His opponent was, as you know, Barry Goldwater, who he ran, Senator Goldwater ran a campaign believing there was an outside chance he could win. Nonetheless, President Johnson comes into the presidency, has tremendously positive ideas about social policy, such things as the Voting Rights Act, which changed the dynamic politics for the rest of the 20th century in this country and beyond. And he was a strong supporter of the Vietnam War because it was his story. I, for one, believed it. He was a strong supporter of the war, partly because President Kennedy had been a strong supporter of the war. At any rate, in the 1966 campaign, this is off year. President Johnson's been elected, if you follow me, in 64. Now he wants a Congress that will stay with him. 1966. Comes up to 66, he's campaigning for Democratic candidates. And he has his mind on running for re-election in 1968. At any rate, the war was in many ways not going well. President Johnson, his popularity from the 64 campaign faded. He goes through this period where every time he turns around, he's getting a lot of criticism. He changes press secretaries, brought in a press secretary from Texas named George Christian. Here's what happened, that Christian came in, straight talking, sort of a cowboy type character. He's now gone, he might not appreciate being described that way, but he was sort of taciturn. Kind of said, yup, no, didn't try to talk things. President Johnson brought him in and said, George, I got a big problem. He said, one thing is the press keeps going around saying on this Vietnam War, which is not very popular, they keep saying that I once said, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. That's his quote, not mine. But he said to George, he said, and you know, excuse my French here, he said, God damn it, George, I never said it. This is a case of the press twisting this around. I'm getting hit over the head. Does this sound familiar to you in any way? Politicians frequently complain about these things. Well, Christian said, well, Mr. President, I'll look into it. I'm not sure I can do anything about it, but I'll look into it. And the President said, George, you get out and fix it, because I'm telling you I never said it. Christian did a lot of research. He came back in a few days, and he had in a wheelbarrow, which was his, literally a wheelbarrow. He had a wheelbarrow in and stacks newspaper clip. He said, Mr. President, I'm not through with my research yet, but I do want you to know that I've been looking into it, and the problem may be deeper than you even know, because all these facts and printed material have you directly quoted, not indirectly quoted. They have you directly quoted as saying what you will not send American boys to do, what Asian boys should do for themselves. The President said, you know, George, you know how them some bitches lie? I mean, I'm telling you, I never said it. Christian says, it's okay. I'm looking into it. But a week later, he comes back to the President, he has a tape recorder. In those days, tape recorders were about this size, so-called portable ones. Big, old-fashioned tape recorder. He said, Mr. President, I want to play you something here. I haven't finished my research, but I just want to tell you what the dimensions of the problem. So he put the tape recorder down, and there was the unmistakable voice of Lyndon Johnson saying, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. Well, President Johnson, who also had these huge hands, came down, he practically wrecked the tape recorder, slammed it down, he says, damn it, George, I thought you were smarter than that. He said, you know what them some bitches can do. They take these little razor blades and they cut these things like this and that. He said, I'm really surprised you. Christian said, okay, Mr. President, I'm looking into it. Short time after that, they have a theater in the White House. The President has a theater of his own. And President Johnson had invited some people to the theater. They were showing, of course, the Alamo, which you always like to see. And Christian came up to him and said, he's here, Mr. President, when this is over, if you don't mind staying about 10 or 15 minutes, I have something I need to talk to you about. So when it was over, President Johnson motioned forward, and George said, now, Mr. President, I want you to get mad at me, but I just want to put something up on the screen now that there are two of us in here. And there is a campaign picture in moving pictures, in those days it was filmed, of President Johnson standing on the bumper of his presidential limousine in a dark street corner in Philadelphia saying, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. There's a pause, the lights come on, and President Johnson turned around and says to Christian, damn, George, you sure that's me? That story, as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said in another context, has the added advantage of being true. But leave you with this book. And one reason for taking you through that sometimes takes too long to tell the story, I recognize, but it's in the nature of politicians. And by the way, I have tremendous respect for anybody who puts their name on the ballot and has the guts to run, whether I agree with them or not, whether I think they should be running or not. It takes a lot of guts to do that. But it's in the nature of politicians, and particularly this has grown as a trend in recent years, to take the view that they want to command any landscape that they occupy. They want to have, it's called, some of them call it command of the message. And part of the way politicians have long wanted to do this, over the years, some of them begin to develop techniques. But we're now in the 21st century where they've developed the technique to what I consider to be, if not an extreme level, one that you should consider. And it is this. It's a philosophy that goes this way. We need to, our party, our candidate, name it, we need to command any landscape we occupy. We need to keep command of the message. And to do that, it may be necessary on the press to push back, this would be their words, push back hard. It's a way of, these are my words, it's a way of working the refs. Ever in the basketball game where the coach is constantly walking the sidelines, saying things in the referee's ear that you can't hear? Anybody who's been in sports knows what it is to work the refs. Part of it is to work the refs. The other part of it is to induce fear. And not just fear in the individual journalist or the people who work in his or her newsroom. It's also, in many ways, more important to induce fear into the ownership of the journalistic enterprise. Now, I'm calling your attention to this because if you want to be an informed and intelligent viewer. Among the many things that you need to understand about how the game is played, increasingly what's going on, what's really going on, as opposed to what somebody may be trying to convince you what's going on, is this business of, and it is for them, for those in political life, many of them, it is a business of you can call it what you want, pushback, working the refs, intimidation, but if you aren't aware of it, you need to be aware of it. Where I'm going with this is that increasingly you need to get your news and information from a variety of places. There's a whole other school of thought that says, no, you shouldn't do that. You should decide what it is you believe, decide who it is you're for, what you're for, and then read publications or listen to radio, watch television that agrees with you. My strong recommendation, nothing original or profound in this, is that now more than ever, partly because the one thing I mentioned before, but only partly because of that, the more variety that you get in your reading, listening, and viewing about the campaign, the better chance you have of making up your own mind. Now, I find the timekeeper has given me the signal here that if we do want to get off on time,